I'm excited to welcome you all to this interesting and timely conversation about technology and alternative energy. I'd like to begin by giving a few more words of introduction about Dr. Varun Sivaram. So Varun has a long background in alternative energy. He holds a doctorate in physics and is the Philip D. Reed Fellow for Science and Technology at the Council on Foreign Relations. He teaches a class on clean energy innovation at Georgetown. He has advised the mayor of Los Angeles and the governor of New York. And given all that, Dr. Sivaram is about 68 years old. He just looks incredibly young. Besides, alternative energy is just one of what he does. This potion for youth is another. But most important and timely for tonight, he's the author of a great new book called Taming the Sun, which I encourage you to read because I think the high-level things we're going to talk about tonight I don't really think do justice to some of the really fascinating stories and thoughts and perspective that you really get into in the book. It's an ambitious title, but probably not more ambitious than a lot of the ideas out here in Silicon Valley. And I think with that, that's a great place to start. You know, in 2016, you write, Varun, that solar energy made up 2% of the world's electricity, but your core argument is really that it can be much, much more. So as we start out, let's take a step back and tell us, why should we care about solar power?
Well, thanks, Matt. And I want to say thank you to the World Affairs Council for having me here. I'm also thrilled that some of my friends and family are here in the audience. My mom, to whom the book's dedicated, the Creasmans, who basically helped raise me, Ellen, who went to college with me. To answer your question, why solar power? Look, today solar may very well account for only 2% of the world's electricity supply. But every hour, the sun beams down more energy than the world uses in an entire year. I mean, solar energy is by far our most abundant energy source. And in my opinion, it's the planet's best hope for a clean energy transition. Solar energy should really anchor that transition, even if it's not the only energy source that we depend on.
So you said it's not the only energy source, so why solar? I mean, either professionally or personally, why not wind or other types of renewables or even nuclear? You know, why did you personally pick solar, and why is solar the most important part that we should be talking about now?
Now, I don't want to disparage those other sources. Wind,
can go
for
ahead.
example.
You're
Wind, for example, has been, over the last decade, has been a leading source of renewable energy growth, and I foresee that wind will continue to grow. Nuclear energy in the United States is the largest source of zero-carbon clean energy. And around the world, nuclear energy is the second largest. Hydroelectric energy is the largest source of renewable energy. So there are lots of fantastic low-carbon clean sources. We're going to depend on all of them. But I think, no pun intended, solar is going to eclipse all of these sources because of the tremendous resource potential. Look, don't just take my word for it. Take Shell's word. This is a global oil company that argued just last week in its ambitious scenario of how the world might combat climate change and limit warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius, that solar energy ought to account for a majority, actually 62%, of the world's final energy demand by 2100, by the end of the century. And that's right in line with the goals I lay out in my book, Taming the Sun. So I think that the oil companies, and hopefully everyone in between can come to the agreement that because solar is just so abundant, and we can find solar on almost every spot on the planet, it makes sense to try and harness this source. And yet, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, and yet we've been trying for 3,000 years to do so and haven't had much success except for the last decade.
So that's an interesting point. So if we've been trying for 3,000 years, I mean, what you're saying essentially is what we all know is that the optimism about solar is not new. You know, you can look back and read article after article newspaper about a sense of optimism and energy about solar in particular. But at the same time, particularly in Silicon Valley and the venture capital scene, there's been a lot of disappointment with investments. Right now, we live in an area where you have a White House administration, which is probably one of the least friendly to alternative energy that we can remember in quite some time. So at a time when the energy needs are still true, but that's been true for quite a while, but the political environment is very tough, why are you writing this book now? Why is now an important time to be having this conversation?
Yeah, you talk about disappointment. Tell me about it. I worked at NanoSolar. This was one of those Silicon Valley bets that I'm sure you're familiar with that raised more money, I think, than any other startup except for Facebook in 2007 or 2008, and went bankrupt in 2013. That and many other companies, Solyndra, for example, is the more well-known or notorious solar startup that didn't quite make it. There are a lot of reasons not to be optimistic about solar, especially if you're in Silicon Valley. And yet, I think it's imperative that we think about solar right now, and there are two particular reasons. One is that I actually think we risk becoming complacent about solar. Look, remarkably, solar has become the cheapest, fastest growing source of energy on the planet. You may not know it, given all of solar's travails for centuries and the last few decades, but just in the last few years, the cost of solar has fallen precipitously. And around the world, you're seeing prices for solar energy that were just unheard of a decade ago. From Chile to Mexico to the UAE to Saudi Arabia, remarkably low prices. And it's growing fast. It raised $160 billion just last year, more than any other power source, clean or dirty. So we risk being complacent that solar is on the right track. And I argue in the book that in fact solar could hit a wall, even though it's growing just fine. You know, a decade from now, solar could run into this wall and stop growing in its hockey stick-like trajectory. And if that happens, our hopes for a clean energy transition might be dashed. Now, the second reason, you alluded to it, we are in a political environment where the solar industry isn't getting a whole lot of support, especially in this country. You've seen, for example, President Trump impose tariffs on solar panels, raising the cost of solar in this country. Remarkably, the solar industry is so strong that solar will continue to grow, just not as fast, thanks to these tariffs. And so I think it's important now to take stock of where we stand. We shouldn't be complacent, but at the same time, we need to be realizing that some of these policy measures are just the wrong policy measures to intervene and continue solar's rise. And that's why I wrote the book.
So it's interesting. So there's an opportunity now, and if we don't act, as you argue, there's a lot of risk. We're going to talk about some of those opportunities and risks, but as we start out, just as a basic question, it might be helpful just to level set so we understand how this all works. So for those of us who do not have a doctorate in physics and have not immersed in some of these, the basic question is, how is it possible that we can get all-day power and year-long power when it's not sunny all the time?
Well, the fact is, we don't quite know how to do that for most of our power needs with today's technology. See, the technology
Not just solar technology? We don't know how to do it overall, you mean, or just with solar?
So with solar, today's technology is known as a silicon solar panel. All right, you've all seen them. They're on roofs, for example. And these panels use what's called the photovoltaic effect to convert incoming sunshine instantaneously into electricity. That means that whenever the sun is shining, you're generating electricity. Whenever the clouds come or whenever nightfall sets in, you're no longer generating electricity. So with the solar panel alone today, we don't have a good way of generating, forget year-round electricity, even electricity around the clock. That's not to say, by the way, that we don't have a way of doing it. Other solar technologies, for example, concentrated solar power, which is far behind photovoltaics in deployment, use mirrors to harness the sun's energy and generate heat. And because you can store that heat, you can then generate power 24/7. So there are ways, or for example, you could take your photovoltaic panel, store it in a battery, and produce power 24/7.
And does that exist now? Like right now, are there ways to get solar power even when the sun's not shining?
Right now, technically, I could install solar panels on a roof, have a Tesla home battery system, and I could generate power 24/7 and meet all of my needs. The problem is that it's prohibitively expensive.
So how much would that cost me if I wanted to do that?
It would cost you, tens
Leaving
of
out
thousands.
the cost of the Tesla, but like to power the thing, how much would that cost?
Tens of thousands of dollars.
Tens of thousands of dollars a year?
So your upfront cost would probably be, if not in the high tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars upfront, which you'd amortize over time. Overall, you'd end up paying more for your electricity than what you get from the grid, which turns out to be a pretty effective battery. I'm using air quotes for those of you listening, because it has this benefit of buffering the intermittency of the solar panels on your roof. So if you're connected to the grid, you can treat it like a big battery without investing in the Tesla home battery, right? But the problem is, if we tried to power all of our needs by just putting solar panels on every roof and batteries in every garage, we'd spend a great deal of money more than I think a smarter solution, which is to look at the system level, at the entire electricity system, and try and find a whole range, I'll call it a whole battery of solutions that are not just home batteries to store that energy or to productively use that energy no matter when it's
So
produced.
what do those look like? Like paint a picture for what I would see.
So in addition to batteries, and by the way, I don't just want them in garages, I want them at the larger scale at the distribution grid level, in addition to the batteries that help you store solar energy so you can shift it from a period that might not be very convenient in the middle of the day to a period when you really need it, for example, at dinner time. I might also make my entire electricity grid a whole lot bigger. A larger electricity grid makes it easier to match up volatile supply and demand by smoothing it out over a larger area. I might also rely on smarter customer demand. You know, if customers are able to modulate or ramp up and down their electricity usage to match up with the solar electricity that's flooding the grid at particular inconvenient times, well then my electricity demand can sop up that glut of electricity supply.
So these are system-wide changes that aren't unique to solar, but theoretically they could be used for wind or other types of renewable to allow these spurts and pullbacks from the system itself.
Exactly. We're definitely going to need to apply all of these systemic fixes if you're going to incorporate a large percentage of intermittent renewables, largely from wind and solar, as you mentioned. The last one, by the way, I'll say, the last systemic fix is to make sure that you've got other generators. They could be natural gas power plants, ideally equipped with carbon capture equipment, or even nuclear power plants that can ramp up and down to match or to compensate for the intermittent fluctuations of solar and wind power. So you want this whole portfolio of approaches, especially a diverse generator mix.
So you're talking about, I mean, it strikes me as some pretty ambitious things, in a sense, changing the entire energy grid, talking about solar getting up to a huge amount of our daily power and electricity needs. So Varun, take us into the future, you know, say 20 to 50 years, or even to 2100 as the oil company did. You know, paint us a picture of what a world powered by solar could look like. What are the things we can't even like imagine right now?
So I'll use 2050
Okay.
as my canvas.
Okay.
And in 2050, my hope is that we don't see a single device that looks like today's solar panels. Today's solar panels, I hope, would have become quaint historical relics or artifacts.
Okay.
Because in that future in 2050, what I want to see is a whole range of new solar technologies that look, frankly, aesthetically pleasing. They're
So
coatings,
what do
for
they look
example.
like?
You know, they're colorful coatings. I have windows that look kind of like stained glass, but really what they're doing is harnessing some wavelengths of light and generating electricity and reducing the carbon footprint of that building that's now got these beautiful stained glass windows. I've got these cheap solar coatings that are coating weak roofs in the developing world that otherwise wouldn't be able to sustain the load of heavy solar panels. You know, I've got technologies that even enable me to convert solar energy into portable fuels. You have these football field-sized tarps of materials that are able to harness the sun's energy and split water. And you're collecting fuels through these pipes that come out of the tarp. A range of really cool technologies that at scale are transforming our energy systems, not just our electricity systems. That's what the future could look like.
So in this future, I like the idea of the stained glass windows, things looking prettier. I'm wearing a solar tie. I was wearing a tie. How much will it cost me? Like under your solar future in 2050, what do my monthly and yearly electricity bills look like?
So look, you asked me to paint you a future. I'll
Yeah.
tell you in that future you could paint your house with solar.
Okay.
And it should be just as cheap as painting your house with paint. Your electricity bills, ideally, will fall by an order of magnitude. You should pay hardly anything for electricity because the abundance of solar energy has made electricity, I shudder to say this, too cheap to meter. And the reason I shudder to say this is because back in the post-war era, 50s and 60s, boosters of nuclear energy, once called nuclear, our next great hope for cheap, clean energy, and that it too would be too cheap to meter. And unfortunately, that hope was never realized. So I want to say that even though I have these high hopes for solar energy, there is this risk that solar energy runs into a similar kind of wall as what we saw with nuclear energy that prevents its hopes from being realized.
So you mentioned the wall, which is definitely what we've run into. So, what can we learn about the solar movement from a lot of the failed expectations of nuclear power?
You might not think that nuclear has very much to do with solar at all. It's rising costs and activists and accidents that have plagued nuclear, and so you might say none of these are going to plague solar, and so no similar wall exists. But I think there's this underlying problem that's plagued nuclear that could similarly plague solar, and that underlying problem is known as technology lock-in, the emergence of a dominant first-generation technology. In the case of nuclear, it's the light water reactor that the US Navy popularized first for submarines, then for aircraft carriers, and then for nearly every civilian nuclear reactor on the planet. That first-generation technology has locked out advanced and probably superior nuclear designs that wouldn't have many of the safety drawbacks, may even have beneficial fuel cycle characteristics, and could be cheaper. In the case of solar, what I really worry about is that in 2050, in that future that we painted, today's silicon solar panels are not relics. They are the dominant mode of deploying solar. And if that's the case, we may have well been locked in to today's technology. And today's technology doesn't enable that bright future, that future in which you get to paint your house with solar. So I fear that if today's technology maintains its dominance, and the Silicon Valley startups deploying innovative technologies ran into a brick wall of Chinese silicon solar behemoths, well, if they continue their dominance, solar's current technology may run into its limits. And we might hit that wall where today's technology is simply not cheap or versatile enough to deal with the challenges that are coming. Because, you alluded to them earlier, we don't know how to integrate a great deal of solar economically on today's energy systems with today's technology.
So there's a real risk there potentially. So one thing is, it's exciting and good to be optimistic about this. But of course, when you're talking about policymaking and when we get into the national security implications of energy, it reminds me there's an old joke that they used to tell at the CIA is everyone's pretty paranoid that when you see flowers, the first thing someone asks is, well, who died? So we're looking at maybe some of the drawbacks that you don't usually hear as part of the solar power story. So what are the drawbacks of solar power? Or is it just sort of an unlimited good that we should only be 100% enthusiastic about?
The drawbacks are right in front of us. Look, solar, in contrast to fossil fuels, is extremely inconvenient. Solar energy is diffuse compared with the density of fossil fuels. It is highly irregular around the planet, and it's highly intermittent. Sometimes it hides behind the clouds, sometimes it scorches the terrain. Solar energy is super inconvenient to harness. And so that's the drawback. And as you install a whole lot of solar power on a particular grid, what you find is that solar tends to cannibalize its own value. And I think we're going to see this more and more.
Explain that more.
Yeah.
What does it mean to cannibalize its own value?
Well, so the first solar panel you put on a grid, it's pretty useful, right? Because perhaps you're in a sunny climate, you have a lot of air conditioning demand right in the middle of the day, and that solar panel is helping you meet that demand. It's saving you from having to spin up some dirty and expensive fossil fuel plant to meet that peak demand. Mm-hmm. But what happens when you have a whole lot of solar panels? Well, that mass of solar panels is going to inject a glut of electricity right in the middle of the day. You've already shaved that peak from the peak demand of, say, air conditioning. And now that you've largely saturated your customer demand in the middle of the day, what you're left with is a new peak in the evening time. And the next solar panel no longer is very useful. That's how solar cannibalizes its own value. We see this in some frontier markets.
And does it become harmful at that point, or just it's wasted? Because it's just a solar panel sitting on the roof. Why does that actually cause harm?
Yeah, so exactly. In one sense, you can say, look, that solar panel is just useless now. You're probably going to throw away its energy. But it also could be harmful, because the more your grid relies on solar electricity, the more your other generators are forced to ramp up and down to compensate for the solar electricity. What's more, solar panels work
and
in
that ramping up and down is expensive,
It's
or
expensive
causes
and causes wear and tear to those generators. In addition, solar panels operate in a fundamentally different principle than other generators. It's kind of spooky, right? You can have this slab that sits and it produces electricity and there are no moving parts. Well, the lack of moving parts is actually a problem. Other generators have literally spinning masses that spin around and provide what's called inertia to the grid. And when you reduce the amount of inertia that the grid can count on from conventional generators, and you have a lot of solar panels, it becomes tougher for the grid to respond to a disturbance. If anything wrong happens, the grid isn't as self-correcting as it previously was when you had a lot of spinning masses that would bring the system parameters, for example, the frequency, back to its normal operating level. So there are actually some deleterious effects of an increased penetration of solar. It's not just that you can chalk it up to being worthless.
And that's an important point that we don't usually hear about. I mean, while we're talking in the realm of pessimism, we talked about, or you've talked about the grid quite a bit. And one element of the grid that has gotten more attention has been its vulnerability, maybe from cyber attacks. So even if we put solar into our electricity grid, that may solve our dependence on fossil fuels, but the grid may still be vulnerable to cyber attacks. So can you give us a sense of how vulnerable our electricity grid and system is today from these types of things that we're starting to read about in the papers?
This is something that is, even though we're reading it in the papers, it's undercovered, and we should be a lot more scared. And there's this fundamental paradox that I see. As we make the grid more distributed using assets such as rooftop or distributed solar panels, you make the grid safer from certain physical disturbances. The more distributed your grid is, the harder it is for any one failure to compromise the rest of the grid because you're more reliant on local resources. That sounds like a good thing. The problem is the more distributed you are, for example, the more internet-connected appliances you have, the more distributed solar panels and batteries and electric vehicles you have connecting to the grid, the more access points you have for a cyber threat to intrude on your network. Once upon a time, we had an electric power system that was secure thanks to this phenomenon of security by obscurity. It was hard enough to control the electric power system, let alone hack into it. But today, with the proliferation of access points, there are serious threats. You could have anything from a foreign attacker to a disgruntled insider who already has access codes for the network. And that's why I think that it's extremely important that electric power utilities, who traditionally have not had to think very hard about cybersecurity, really need to get up to speed. It's not good enough to say, we're going to try and erect a wall around the electric power system, preventing hackers from getting in. I think you need a multi-layered defense architecture that says, I'm going to try my best to prevent intrusions, but if intrusions do happen, I'm going to detect them and shut them down as fast as I can. I'm going to use machine learning to monitor the traffic on my network because increasingly we are seeing communication networks pervading these electricity networks. Shut down threats as soon as they emerge and prevent attacks both from outsiders and insiders. There's a whole field that's burgeoning. I think, Matt, you are a leader in this field, and I hope that the approaches that you work on in organizations outside of the electric power sector can be imported for electric power.
So it's interesting, but it's a good point that as we take these leaps, potentially in solar power, we do need to be thinking about security at the same time. There's another element of the security question that you touched on a little bit is the role of China. So you write very interesting about the greater role that China has played in manufacturing silicon solar panels and all that, the role of President Trump's tariffs related a number of things. So how worried should we be about America's place in the world and leading in solar? And related to that, should we be worried that China is producing so much of solar materials if you're talking about that we should become even more dependent on solar energy?
It's a great question. I'm personally more worried from the economic competitiveness angle than I am from the national security angle, although both could be very important considerations. Let me break each of them down. From the competitiveness angle, look, this is a $160 billion industry that is only growing. Countries around the world are deploying solar at record rates. Almost every single market is booming, from Latin America to Asia to Africa to Europe to North America. So if China has monopolized this market, China's going to reap the lion's share of the dividends, the prosperity. And it behooves the United States to try and become more competitive in order to gain a share of that growing economic pie. But the other point that you raise is that, look, if China is seeking to become the new Saudi Arabia of clean energy, by the way, Saudi Arabia also wants to be the Saudi Arabia of clean energy, well, aren't there security risks? Because today there are all kinds of geopolitical considerations wrapped up in resource dominance by particular countries. For example, in the Middle East, shouldn't we be worried that China might control the supply of solar panels? I'm not yet worried about that. I think that there is a diverse enough pool of suppliers, not just in China, but also in Southeast Asia, that our dependence on Asia for solar is not yet a security concern. It's also, solar is a very small part of our energy mix, but as it grows, we might well care. And I also think we're going to care about the resources, the minerals, say like cobalt, that underpin some of the clean energy resources that could be very important in a world dominated not by fossil fuels, but by batteries that require cobalt, by wind turbines that require rare earth minerals, etc. So I do think we should worry about the dominance by particular countries over mineral resources, and we should worry about manufacturing dominance that's geographically concentrated.
So in terms of when you talk about dominance in Chinese leadership in some areas, I want to get into next what more we can do. But before we talk about what the United States needs to do more and what we're not getting right, what countries in the world or country are getting it right? Are there any countries that we should turn to as a model for, yeah, that's how it could be working well, or that's the type of leadership that's realistic or innovation that we should be talking about for these really hard problems?
Absolutely. So look, China's getting a lot right. We absolutely can afford to learn from them.
And
I think
what should we learn? What are like some of the key lessons?
So, as I mentioned to you, there are multiple kinds of innovation that we're going to need. We're going to need systemic innovation to make our systems more flexible. China is leading in certain aspects of that. For example, China is building high voltage direct current transmission lines. These are really long distance transmission lines, hundreds of miles. And it's building a network of these lines across the country. And that's going to enable China to integrate a whole lot more renewable energy than if it didn't build out a continental grid. China, in fact, has designs to build a global supergrid because the sun's always shining somewhere, but which I don't think is going to happen for a variety of reasons. The United States, however, is behind. You know, our first ultra high voltage direct current line between Tennessee and Oklahoma is still, in the process of being developed. We could do a whole lot better on building a cross-continental grid. And, academic studies show that if we're going to achieve a share of, say, 60% renewable energy, including wind and solar and hydroelectricity, well, we're probably going to need that nationwide grid to do so affordably. So I think we can learn from China on that. I also think we can learn from China on another kind of innovation, technological innovation. Look, 10 years ago, I would never have said this. The United States is the undisputed leader when it comes to innovation of all kinds, especially energy in the post-war era, when the United States ramped up its investments in energy research, development, and demonstration. But China is going to pass the United States. It's forecast to pass U.S. spending by 2021. And if it does so, and Chinese authors account for a rising share of high-impact journal articles, and Chinese labs are lavishly funded, if that happens, we could see breakthrough technologies emanating from Chinese labs and not U.S. labs. I think that will be bad from the economic and the geopolitical angles.
So there's clearly a lot to be done, as you mentioned. And you mentioned the need for big systemic change, about a moonshot. And we need a moonshot, but the reality is most people think government's pretty broken right now. We haven't gone to the moon or sort of realized those types of grand government-led ambitions in quite some time, despite all the talk about, there's a war on something new or a moonshot analogy, but it hasn't happened. So as you look at all these really natty problems, what makes you think any of this can actually happen?
Now, I actually think the moonshot or the Apollo way of thinking about this is wrong. I do not expect a World War II style mobilization, for example, or a get a man on the moon style mobilization of resources for a project like this. And thank heavens, I don't actually think we need it to achieve breakthroughs in solar technology. I actually think that the breakthroughs are relatively feasible, and that's why I'm hopeful. I think, for example, President Obama's commitment for the United States and other leading economies to double their investments in research, development, and demonstration is totally within reach. For the United States, it would require doubling from $6.4 billion to $12.8 billion a year in energy innovation. And look, just last week, President Trump signed into law Congress's omnibus spending bill, which miraculously increased funding for solar energy research by 16%. And that is, right in line with what it'll take to double funding in 5 years. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised that congressional Republicans are on board with the kind of spending increases we're going to need to see real breakthroughs. This stuff's not going to break the bank. We're talking about, single-digit or double-digit billions of dollars. This is a rounding error on the federal budget. Now, that's not to say that everyone's on board, and President Trump almost certainly is not. It was President Trump's budget proposal that wanted to slash renewable energy research and development by over 66%, and he wanted to entirely eliminate one of our most innovative organizations, ARPA-E, which is the Energy Department's analog to the Defense Department's DARPA, which funds far-sighted technology bets. Look, it would be catastrophic if we failed to fund some of these innovative organizations. So I think, super important that folks on both sides of the aisle in Congress continue to keep the pressure on this administration to support, and frankly, it's not even this administration's choice how much to appropriate to these goals. Congress needs to keep the momentum behind funding energy innovation.
So Congress has one role. The Trump administration has done another. Clean tech and climate change has actually been hugely important in California in a sense that Governor Brown and others have, in a sense, pursued almost a foreign policy in trying to stand up against climate change despite that's going on. So as we sit out here in San Francisco, what can California do to help make the vision you're talking about more of a reality?
California is so important. I'm thrilled that I get to say this message here because California can serve as this shining beacon for the rest of the world on how to integrate a large percentage of solar energy. Look, it's one of the leading markets for solar. Over 10% of our energy comes from solar in California. And California is at the leading edge of facing these problems. In California, because of this high percentage of solar energy, the price of power went negative in the middle of the day this month. So California is going to have to deal with these challenges. How can it serve as a shining beacon? Well, I think the first thing it should do is try and expand its grid. There's an initiative to try and get California to join up with other Western states and integrate the economic market for electricity so that there's a single integrated grid and integrated economic market that dispatches renewables, say wind in Wyoming, solar in Arizona, to the most efficient destinations. You do that, and the percentage of renewables on California's expanded Western grid could be much higher than if California remains kind of economically isolated in its current configuration. That's just one of the many ways that California can prove to the rest of the world that, hey, it is possible to integrate a whole lot of solar energy.
We have some questions from the audience that folks have written down on paper, so I'll go through some of those as we continue the conversation. So one question is, how difficult is it for companies to make this move towards green energy and green power? And what are the challenges of your company trying to do this? Do you need, and what impact will some of the upcoming tariffs have on companies trying to make the transition you're talking about?
Fantastic question. Corporate procurement of solar energy is an increasingly important, I think the fastest growing driver of solar energy adoption. Historically, solar energy adoption has been driven, for example, by mandates, like California's Renewable Portfolio Standard. But increasingly, companies now are saying, hey, we want to go solar, and they're driving adoption. The problem, though, is that companies are very price sensitive. They'll adopt solar, but it's got to make economic sense. A mandate, by contrast, is not a price-sensitive driver of solar adoption. And the tariffs by President Trump increase the price of solar. And as a result, they'll cause a 10 to 15% reduction in solar deployment over the next 5 years. You'll see corporate procurement of solar get impacted by these tariffs because they're price sensitive. I think if you're a company, there are many ways for you to install solar, but it really depends on what kind of a jurisdiction, what kind of a state you operate in. In some cases, we've seen companies take some pretty extreme measures. MGM Casinos decided to secede, I don't know if that's the right word, to desert their utility, NV Energy, because they wanted to install a whole lot more solar energy than they thought they were going to be able to as part of the utility. That's an extreme example, but increasingly there are ways for solar companies, for companies that want to go solar and their utilities to cooperate and ensure that they're able to install energy and still remain connected to the grid and use the services of that utility.
Got it. On this, another question we have is more nuts and bolts about how this works. So The question is a solar roof far better than just the installation of panels on a roof?
Great question. I think what this listener is asking is, are those roof tiles that we saw Elon Musk demonstrate on the set of Desperate Housewives, are those better than just putting solar panels on your roof? And it depends what you mean by better. From a cost perspective, almost certainly not. Those roof tiles are pretty expensive. Elon Musk may say that the roof tiles are cheaper than equivalent roof tiles, but what he's talking about is like the most expensive kind of terracotta roofing you could have. But from an aesthetic point of view, yeah, I mean, a lot of folks will say, I would prefer to have roof shingles that look pretty and happen to generate electricity than putting solar panels on my roof. I think in the future, we can have the best of both worlds. Mm-hmm. In the future, when we have these aesthetic, cheap, lightweight coatings, we're going to have building integrated materials. We're going to have shingles that come with built-in solar coatings that are both cheaper or as cheap as existing roofing materials, are pretty, and generate electricity for you at low cost and meet your needs.
So one was the follow-up question that someone else asked is, so we talked about the aesthetic value. What is to stop, when listener asks, since it is sunny in some sometimes and not sunny others, what's to stop us from just building panels in the most arid deserts we have the most sunlight, even around the world, and then just building better transmissions lines to bring that power into the dark places?
And that is a terrific idea. I think that the most economical solar panels or solar installations are the ones where you build at huge scale in the areas that get the most sun, say the Mojave Desert. The problem is then you got to factor in the cost of the transmission line, and that does add some to the cost of that installation, but in many cases, it does make sense. But look, I'm a believer in portfolio theory, and I think we're going to need a whole range of different approaches. In the case of solar, we should take advantage of its versatility. Solar does great in large installations out in the desert. It's also able to be distributed. And I think that the sweet spot for solar is somewhere in between that massive Mojave Desert installation and that rooftop installation on your home that's actually pretty expensive, and hey, you may have a tree in your backyard that shades your roof, so not a great idea. Somewhere in the middle is solar that is at a scale to power, say, hundreds or thousands of homes. We call this the megawatt scale, and it's in land that's relatively near a city, near the electrical equipment, like a substation that's able to bring that solar energy to a neighborhood, a community. And you're getting the best of all worlds. You're getting the economies of scale because it's large enough that you don't need to extremely customize that installation like a rooftop one. But it's also near to the electrical network, and you don't have to go and build out expensive transmission or step up and down the voltage. That, I hope, is the sweet spot. We're going to see increasingly jurisdictions and localities building out this megawatt scale solar.
Interesting. So you've talked about megawatt scale solar. We talked about the Mojave Desert. The next question goes to the Arctic. The question is, how about solar panels in the Arctic? Could that help reduce ice melt? I've never heard this question before, which I think was completely fascinating to ask.
I have never heard this question either, but I will say, for many isolated Arctic communities, solar can make sense. A solar and a battery hookup, for example, in an isolated community where you can't extend the grid, might be a cost-effective replacement for, say, a diesel generator, where oftentimes you are at the whims of the distribution of diesel fuel. That diesel fuel can sometimes cost you a lot. You might run out of it. It might make sense increasingly to make a solar and storage system. More broadly, I do think that solar and storage microgrids can be deployed in areas where resilience is really important. You really don't want to have power outages. That could be anything from a military base to a hospital. And in Puerto Rico, I think that a core component of rebuilding that island's grid is going to be equipping critical facilities, wastewater treatment plants, for example, with solar and storage microgrids. So again, this is just another indicator of solar's versatility.
What is a solar storage microgrid?
This is, sorry, that's jargon. I really should...
It sounds really cool. I just didn't want to let it go by.
I've been talking about this stuff too much. So in contrast to the large grid that you and I know and love, a microgrid is a smaller version of the large grid that serves a particular community or a particular facility, like a military base. That microgrid is capable of operating seamlessly with the grid, so it can support the grid. But in a case of an emergency, that microgrid can turn into what's called an island, where the microgrid itself is using its distributed energy sources, fuel cells, solar panels, batteries, in order to power the needs of that particular facility. And so advanced microgrids are actually a great tool that we can use to improve resilience, increase the penetration of clean renewable energy, and ideally provide power at lower cost.
So the follow-up from that issue, I mean, the idea of microgrids is fascinating. In your book, you talked about energy poverty in a lot of developing countries. Parts of the world we don't really think about that just don't have access to basic electricity. It creates all these other issues. And you raise an issue which I think is actually a similar and interesting question development. Over countries and regions part of Africa that were able to use mobile to leap over the lack of landline, to use technology to create new infrastructure that solved enormous problems and creates potential opportunities. So how real is the promise of solar energy to do that in the developing worlds and the parts that they just don't have power right now that are huge impediments to economic growth?
I am cautiously enthusiastic about this prospect. So this idea of leapfrogging is seductive. Look, a sub-Saharan African country where the grid infrastructure is poorly built out, maybe you could just leapfrog the whole process of industrializing and building a big grid. You could just jump right over that and build these decentralized microgrids and provide electricity access at lower cost to everybody. I think that is seductive but misleading.
Interesting.
I think that there is a hybrid solution that we should strive toward. Centralized grid electricity still is the most tried and true and cost-effective way of extending energy access. And it's been hugely successful, not just in the developed world, but in the developing world as well. A Nature Climate Change study suggested that in order to provide electricity to the over 1 billion people who lack it, and continue to provide electricity for the rising demand of increasing cities, we're going to need about 2/3 of the gains to come from extending centralized grids, and 1/3 of the gains to come from, for example, solar-powered microgrids or other off-grid solutions. So I think solar has an important role to play. It could electrify hundreds of millions of people. The way to do this is to say, look, which are the areas that are really hard to reach with the grid? Which are the areas where, for various reasons, perhaps a lack of resources, poor institutions in a country, we're just not going to be able to extend that centralized grid to meet that village's needs? Well, in that case, it's possible to meet those needs of those folks who may not have ever had access to electricity with individual solar home systems or a microgrid that networks together a community and serves them using solar power. Now, oftentimes, the folks there won't be able to afford the upfront cost of a solar electricity system, plus the batteries, plus the power electronics, plus the energy-efficient appliances. But there are new business models being pioneered by entrepreneurs in order to allow those folks to pay on a monthly basis using mobile money, as you mentioned. And in doing so, you actually bring electricity for the first time to folks who can't afford that monthly payment. You'd be surprised at how much some of these folks are willing to pay for electricity, to charge their cell phones, to light their homes, to even power television, which is one of the most popular uses of electricity in these off-grid settings.
So you talked about investment a few times, and a key part is we need a lot more investment. But in Silicon Valley and venture capital, a lot of the early clean tech investments, as the company you talked about that you almost worked for, really went down to zero and were seen as large problems. So many people are burned. There's a sense it hadn't worked. Why is it different now? And why now, if I'm making an investment and where to allocate scarce dollars, I should take a bet on solar when I haven't in the past? Or maybe I did in the past and I got completely burned, so to speak.
That's a great pun. That's a
Just
burning
came
question.
naturally. Yeah, okay. We're going to get censored if we like. The FCC's not going to like that.
So Matt, you'll appreciate this. A paper I wrote a couple years ago at the council was called VC and Clean Tech, the Wrong Model for Innovation, where I said that venture capital investors just aren't cut out for clean tech. I got this explosive reaction from the clean tech community and from a lot of investors who said, hey, you've got this all wrong. There is actually a growing, burgeoning clean tech investment community. and they're investing in companies that are different from the companies that went belly up 5-10 years ago. These companies are marketing digital innovations. They're companies that are focused, rather than on energy supply from new solar materials, they're focusing on reducing energy demand. For example, I'm going to pick on my sister because I just noticed she's in the audience. My sister Utara works at an energy efficiency company known as Bidgely. Bidgely helps customers disaggregate their appliances. So you can say from your smart meter, which appliances are you using? You're using your washing machine, you're using your lighting, you're using your television, and help customers save money as a result by saving energy. Now, these companies require less capital from venture capitalists, and they also require shorter time horizons to realize returns. And therefore, I think this new wave of clean energy investment could make a whole lot of sense for investors who got burned, no pun intended. Now, that's not to say that the original type of investment in new solar materials makes sense for VC investors. I don't think it does. And that's why I think, because such investments are super important, I think that the government needs to step in. And I think that other investors also are going to be needed. Bill Gates has a new coalition called the Breakthrough Energy Fund, or Breakthrough Energy Ventures. And they're what are known as patient capital investors. They're willing to invest large chunks of money for long periods of time, a decade or more, in some of these capital-intensive new energy supply technologies, whether they're in nuclear or solar fuels. I also think that the federal government is going to have to plug some of these investment gaps. They're going to have to invest in research, development, the first-of-a-kind field demonstration to embolden the private sector that otherwise is going to say, hey, I've gotten burned one too many times.
But we've had that issue before, in the sense Solyndra was one of the most talked about parts of loan guarantees that happened in the Obama administration.
Yeah.
And as a lot of things do with highly speculative investments, they do fail. So given the public reaction around the Solyndra, how is it possible to get the types of government support for investments that you say are necessary?
The first thing I want to say about Solyndra is that the federal government's loan guarantee approach was not risky enough. Not that it was too risky. We shouldn't take Solyndra as his data point and say, oh my God, an investment failed. This approach was flawed. No, actually, the large majority of the loan guarantee program went to very safe investments, and that was a mistake in my opinion. Now, it is the case that there was a public backlash because $500 million went down the drain when Solyndra went bankrupt.
That's real money.
And that's real money.
Even at the Pentagon.
That's real taxpayer money. And so, my policy recommendation is, in the future, if you're supporting demonstration projects, you probably should do so in smaller bite sizes. It's probably a better idea to spread some of that investment among a larger set of companies. It's probably also a better idea to structure your demonstration funding support so that you're not supporting it through a politically controlled entity, through the Department of Energy, but rather you have an independent, for example, federally chartered corporation, something that has an arm's length approach, an arm's length relationship from the federal government and isn't subject to political control. So you can depoliticize some of these investments. It's not a Republican or a Democratic investment. This is an independent entity tasked with finding the most promising demonstration projects to help U.S. energy innovation. So I think there are a lot of ways to fix this approach. I don't think the lesson we should take away is, hey, federal government better get out of the business of helping companies scale up their technologies, because without that federal government support, we're just going to see very little private sector interest.
So it's interesting. On another side, taking it a little different direction, one of the questions from the audience is, just like nuclear energy is not really clean because we haven't solved the problem of nuclear waste, how does solar have associated difficulties, such as access to the types of rare materials that are used to create the panels, to disposing of them, or some of the other concerns that are maybe difficult to deal with some of those?
I think we're probably going to have a solar panel recycling problem. It may not be now, but it'll be in a decade or two when you have a whole lot of solar panels that have made it through their entire service lifetime. Solar panels, by the way, do very well. They're warranted for 20, 25 years, and they can continue to produce for decades after that. But at some point, we are going to need to recycle a whole bunch of solar panels, given the rate of growth.
And can you dispose of them? I mean, are they safe? I can't just throw them in a trash can or dumpster, can I?
You probably should disassemble them. You probably should find a way to recycle the polymers, the metals, the glass, the semiconductor inside. Fortunately, none of these are really bad things. None of these are really toxic materials. In the case of one company, First Solar, that makes a non-silicon panel, they use cadmium in their panels. But I will say First Solar is a leader probably the best solar company out there in developing an integrated life cycle approach. They help their customers recycle their panels, and I think other companies would do well to follow the example they set. So I think companies will need to go ahead and set up recycling programs. I don't think, however, that right now they have the foresight to do that. You know, in many cases, solar panel companies are just trying to stay afloat next quarter, let alone 20 years down the line when they got to recycle these panels. So it might take a push from public policymakers to suggest that these guys go ahead and set up recycling programs.
So taking it a little different direction, going back to the nuts and bolts, the next question is, Varun, you've talked about the high voltage direct current, low current transmission lines. What do they do for the grid, and how are they managed and controlled? And what do they look like? And I'd add to that, if most of the current grid is based around AC and unit inductor to get there, how massive a change is it to really bring sort of direct current from solar into the types of deployments you're talking about?
I promise you, whoever asked that question is an electrical engineer, and I am not happy you asked such a hard question. So
this person's name is Dr. Space, which is, I'm either reading wrong or it's an awesome name in question, who I hope is an engineer. With a name like that, you gotta.
Well, hey,
good
thing I didn't space out during that question.
Wow.
There's like that delayed laugh. So I do get kind of excited when we talk about AC versus DC. You know, back around the turn of the century, we're talking about the turn of the 20th century, there was this pitched battle between boosters of direct current. Thomas Edison wanted our electricity systems to work on direct current. That's very intuitive. That's where electricity flows in one direction. Versus alternating current, supported, for example, by Nikola Tesla, who said, hey, this is a much better way to transmit electricity over long distances. Alternating current is where your current changes direction 60 times a second. Now, Nikola Tesla ultimately won out, but it wasn't before there was a war waged between the two. Edison actually electrocuted farm animals to demonstrate how dangerous high-voltage alternating current was.
Wow.
But at the end of the day, Nikola Tesla wins this argument because at the time, the transformers, in order to change the voltage of electricity, only worked for AC. You know, it only works if you've got 2 coils of wire, that's all they had back in the day, to change alternating current electricity from a low voltage to a high voltage. And a high voltage is what you need to transmit electricity without losing a whole lot of it. Today, however, we no longer have this limitation that we can only transform the voltage of alternating current electricity. We can actually transform the voltage of direct current electricity, and we can do so increasingly cheaply. As a result, direct current is looking far more attractive. Direct current, by the way, Edison was right just a century early. Direct current is the more efficient way of transmitting electricity. We only use it over the longest distances today. But I think that increasingly, direct current will be used at shorter and shorter distances. The problem is, as you mentioned, our entire grid infrastructure is alternating current, and it's really hard to switch over. So the gentleman asked Dr. Space, actually, I don't know whether he's a gentleman or a lady, but Dr. Space argued that, hey, what do these high voltage direct current lines look like, and what do they do for our grid? I actually think they could help to stabilize our grid. You know, if it's possible to connect disparate geographical areas, you might have a energy-hungry megacity connected to an area with excess electricity supply. We see this, for example, when you think about connecting a desert in Rajasthan in India with an energy-hungry city, Mumbai. You see this in the United States when you connect the American Southwest with other demand centers. I actually think you could help to balance the grid out through these long-distance, high-voltage transmission lines. So I think it's very important that we invest in this technology. There are technological improvements that are being made every day. For example, I'm going to throw out some jargon in wide bandgap semiconductors. And I hope the United States tries to catch up with China in the deployment of this technology.
Interesting. So as we move towards the end, another question really gets at the heart of what we've been talking about is, what lessons have we learned from the solar companies that have failed?
We've learned a whole lot. Let me break them into 2 buckets. The innovative solar companies, the NanoSolar, Solyndra of the world, we learned that it takes a long time, much more than 5 years, which is what a venture capitalist often requires for their return. Requires a long time to incubate these technologies in the lab and scale them up to production scale. It takes a lot of capital, hundreds of millions of dollars. And oftentimes you don't want these companies to go up against the incumbent, the behemoth, say the Chinese silicon solar panel manufacturer. So I think the new companies, and I was just talking to one last evening, a startup that might be coming out of Stanford, the new ones are savvy about this. They're developing products for niche applications. For example, unmanned aerial vehicles require solar coatings that have an extremely high power-to-weight ratio. That means you can't put conventional panels on, but as a result, they're going to pay top dollar. They're going to pay $100 per watt for that solar material. For reference, today's solar panels cost 40 cents a watt. So these new companies can target an application that's going to offer them a whole lot more as they scale up their technology. That's a great strategy that solar companies can learn. I also think that we can learn from the failed solar companies that were manufacturers of today's technology here in the United States. You know, back in 2005, the United States accounted for 25% of global manufacturing of solar power. A decade later, it was slashed to less than 5%. And that's a result of, you know, around 2008 to 2012, you saw Chinese companies produce and sell solar panels below cost, wiping out US manufacturers. What can we learn from this? We can learn that, you know, our trade regime needs to react much more quickly to, you know, actions, for example, by the Chinese government. If they do this again with batteries, you could see battery companies go out of business. But
So
I don't think
are you advocating for some of the tariffs that have been talked about?
I'm glad you asked that. I don't actually think that these tariffs make any sense. Because when I say our trade regime needs to react rapidly, tariffs that are imposed a decade after the offense don't make a whole lot of sense. They're closing the barn door well after the horse bolted. These tariffs actually are not going to help our manufacturers out very much. They're not going to really coerce Chinese government behavior to change. In fact, that government behavior happened a decade ago. Today's solar manufacturers just are low-cost manufacturers, not because of government support anymore. So I do think that there are important lessons to learn, but imposing tariffs is not a corollary of those lessons.
So as we wrap up and come to the end of our hour, we're sitting here, we've talked about a lot of very interesting things. Two different visions of the future, about one where solar power can do more, and others where we continue on a destructive path. What the role the private sector can do and what it needs to do, and what the federal government can do with greater investment. And the larger systemic changes we need, not just about solar power, but about security, systemic issues in the grid itself. So for those of us listening and those of us in this room, what can we do individually to bring us closer to the positive vision that you talked about in 2050 and not the way that we may be going in direction if we don't do that?
You know, I think there's a temptation. Each of us might say to ourselves, hey, the best thing I can do is the thing that is most tractable or most tangible for me to do. I can put solar panels on my roof. I can install that Tesla Powerwall in my garage. That's a great idea. I can go net zero. However, the things that intuitively might make you feel good or might seem like a good idea probably aren't the sorts of actions that at a large scale we need society to adopt. It's probably not the case that we need every single person to install solar panels and batteries. What we need are exactly what you mentioned: systemic fixes, investments in innovation. That's going to require individuals to support public policymakers who think rationally about these subjects. That means that you've got to vote for somebody who believes in fostering innovation across these different realms: financial, technological, systemic. That means that you've got to, at the state level, you've got to support regulations from your Public Service Commission. Here in California, it's the California Public Utilities Commission. You've got to support policies that encourage utilities to innovate, because it's going to take a systems-level approach and pressure from the public to support policymakers that want to take that approach if we're going to see real change. So I hope I'm giving you a not well-trodden path answer. It's not individual sustainability that matters, in my opinion, though that is important. It's individuals supporting policymakers, firms, and scientists that apply systemic fixes to solve this challenge in the most cost-effective and clean way possible.
Great. Well, Varun, that is an exciting future and call to action. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and for writing this excellent book. And thank you for all this.
Thanks for having me.
It was great.